No matter what kind of epic fantasy reader you are, you can probably agree on one thing. Epic fantasy is big. And I'm not just talking about the books, but the genre itself. At best, the current booktube landscape splits the fantasy genre into two less than ideal timelines: classic and modern fantasy. But for the past 6 years, I've been binging booktube, reading many of the genre's most classic books, and trying my best to piece together the evolution of this genre that I love so much. And at the end of it, I came up with, if I can be so bold, what I think is the easiest to follow, yet still fairly thorough examination and organization of the fantasy genre. The 6 eras of fantasy. 6 eras spanning all the way from fantasy's somewhat early roots to the very moment you are watching this video. Please note that when I say fantasy, I'm not referring to the fantasy that has existed in literature for thousands and thousands of years, of course. Only the specific modern branch of fantasy that you'd find here on booktube adjacent spaces. These eras and how I split them up aren't the end-all be-all of fantasy education, nor are they truly meant to be a historically backed statement of the genre.
I just made it up.
If you feel like fantasy should be split in different ways or start at a different time, that's totally fine. I'm not here to try to discredit what you think the fantasy genre is, only to introduce a new way that will be relevant for this channel. Because despite this video being about the 6 eras of fantasy, the real thing I want you to take away from this video is this one phrase: the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge. Put simply, the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge is my attempt to read every single major fantasy book in chronological order. That means year by year, era by era, I will be reading as many of these major fantasy releases as I reasonably can in order of publication. And how many books have I decided is a reasonable amount? Currently almost 500, which means for the next, handful of years,
That was a gross understatement.
I will be reading each fantasy book one by one as they were released publication date. And then, of course, documenting the entire journey here on BookTube. That's kind of what this channel is in a nutshell. Now, of course, does this include every single fantasy book in the world? No, this is definitely just a list of the most popular, the most critically acclaimed, the most influential and just iconic fantasy series. And I'm not only certain, I know I'm missing a ton of fantasy books that will be added as I go through each era, which are hopefully going to be based off of your guys' recommendations. As of recording this video, we have technically already begun the challenge, though it is very early days still.
Very much so.
But now, as you might imagine, trying to organize these 500 works of fantasy, it was the reason why I had to make these eras. I needed an easy way to document my journey in terms that every single person can understand, regardless of how experienced they are within the genre. But that means from this day forward, these eras and the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge are the terminology I will be using within the space that is my channel. And so now,
It's time to go!
we're going to go through each of the 6 eras in order, starting at the earliest and bringing you all the way to the era we're in right now. This video is long, but important to what the channel is. So set the vibe, start cleaning your room or something like that. It's a very good time to do it. And let's get into this. The first era of fantasy is called the Bronze Age of fantasy. Certainly not my most creative name, but it just felt right at the time because it clearly articulates what fantasy was at this point. The Bronze Age of fantasy ends in the year 1911 for reasons we will get to. But perhaps the most difficult choice I had to make within this era was when the Bronze Age would begin. Fantasy is a genre that has been around forever in stories, but clearly fantasy we know it is today is a little bit different. And that's the type of fantasy that this channel and these eras will be covering. So the question became, when did the fantasy of old become the fantasy of new? The truest answer to that question is probably that it was just a long, gradual process, but I tried to find a hinge point. I could have gone with ancient myths, epic poems, biblical stories, or old novels with dashes of the fantastical littered within. They are all certainly impactful to the genre, but getting into these kinds of stories was never really my goal and would have simply opened up the floodgates for what counted as fantasy. Does Dracula count as a fantasy? What about the Fairy Queen? And I could have read them all and it would have given me a bigger understanding or whatever, but on a purely selfish note, I didn't want this list to be 1,000 books long. The main thing I needed was just a place to start. So after debating this question for probably too long, I decided to just cope out and ask Google. And it responded with a book that had been on my radar for a little while. Phantastes by George MacDonald. And Phantastes proves rather quickly why it's such a good opening for the genre. It's a portal fantasy, dreamlike and spiritual, all common flavors of Bronze Age fantasy. But fantasy wasn't really a complete genre, commercial genre as we know it today back then. And of course, none of these authors knew that they'd be the start of this new global phenomenon. They probably thought they were just the natural evolution of some older types of genres, like how William Morris does a lot of medieval romanticism, to Alice in Wonderland being a response against moral-driven fairy tales. As the Bronze Age goes on, George MacDonald adds children's books into his own repertoire, such as The Light Princess, The Children of the Goblin, and The Darker Lilith. And by the end of the first half of the Bronze Age, George MacDonald is truly the front man of the fantasy genre. But he, of course, is not alone. William Morris enters the scene and is one of the earliest adapters of the secondary world format that would take the fantasy genre over by storm. Alongside him, H. Rider Haggard becomes influential from almost outside of the genre for his fantasy-leaning adventure flicks, which would become kind of the blueprint for a lot of the fantasy pulp lane. Wizard of Oz arrives and popularizes serialized episodic fantasy stories for children that become fantasy's main moneybags, at least for now. In the second half of the Bronze Age, the famous Lord Dunsany arrives, not yet fully formed, but clearly showing signs of innovation. And with E. Nesbit, kind of the grandmother of fantasy, coming in with a wide selection of acclaimed children's fantasies, the big players of the Bronze Age all play their part. These four big lanes the Bronze Age covers act as kind of the DNA fantasy would build itself with for the next 5 eras. C.S. Lewis called George MacDonald his master and claimed he never wrote a novel without quoting him. William Morris and Dunsany brought in lyrical, medieval flavors to fantasy that would be massively influential on figures like Tolkien. And E. Nesbit has influence spanning all the way from J.K. Rowling to Neil Gaiman. And with Peter Pan kind of acting as my series finale, the Bronze Age kind of ends with a somewhat clear identity. The story I think the fantasy genre is telling at this point in time is actually one of transition. A transition out of genres of the past into something that's new and a little bit under the radar. As of recording this video, I'm only about halfway through the Bronze Age, which is easily the shortest of any of the eras. But already I can see why the Bronze Age needs to exist separately to the era that is coming up next. Because people just love to slot any book that is before 1954 into pre-Tolkien fantasy, as if they're all one big thing. But that to me is truly because very few people ever try to go back and understand these genres as they are forming. Which is why I split the era that I had previously called the pre-Tolkien fantasy era into two. The first age was the Bronze Age, fantasy's mythic, dreamlike, simplistic birth. And the second era of fantasy is the Silver Age, or what I like to call the Great Expansion and Consolidation. The Silver Age begins in the year 1912 and ends in the year 1959. It doubles in length from the Bronze Age from 25 novels to over 50. And the Silver Age is my pick for the messiest and most interesting on face value era of all of them. Because unlike the modern day, the Silver Age of fantasy had no blueprint to base everything off of. Tolkien only emerges at the end of the Silver Age as my big finale. I can't wait to get to this era of fantasy myself, and if you follow me on the journey, you're going to be able to see, as well as I, the transition that happens from the Bronze Age to the Silver Age.
It's expanding.
Because immediately in the year 1912, a little series called Barsoom would be written and released in All Story magazine. After the Bronze Age, pulp magazines like this became widespread, a dominant way to consume speculative fiction as a whole. And while Barsoom is certainly more of a sci fantasy, I think it's so influential and important to this time that I have to have it on the list. It's almost incredible how quickly this shift happened, and I'm going to doubt it's entirely to fantasy's credit. Horror and sci-fi were booming at this time, and so some of them crossed into fantasy territory and became influential there as well. Books like The Nightland, The Moonpool, The Voyage to Arcturus, and while series like Wizard of Oz were popular at the time, I certainly didn't have much interest in reading all 14 of them, but know that they did still exist at the time, releasing at an alarming rate all the way up until the 1920s. Adding in Campbell's Jurgen, a obscure and controversial fantasy book that I'm personally very interested to read, the opening of the Silver Age fantasy feels a whole lot different than Bronze Age. Pulp magazine, archaic sci-fi adventures, all of them coexist in this one timeline. It's only until the 1920s that pure epic fantasy takes its second strides. These come in the form of two of the Silver Age's most famous and celebrated works. The Worm Ouroboros by A.R. Edison, and Lord Dunsany's crowning jewel, The King of Elfland's Daughter. I've even heard some people say they were the very first epic fantasies, especially The Worm Ouroboros. One of the members of the Inklings, E.R. Edison's Worm Ouroboros and even more obscure Ximiamvian trilogy are some of the defining works of the Silver Age, doing a lot of the groundwork for secondary world fantasy that Tolkien would inherit. If you want to learn more about these works of pulp fantasy and Silver Age fantasy as a whole, you can, and probably already have, checked out videos by Origeny Vexred. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He gives a much more detailed and summary-based explanation into pre-Tolkien fantasy. And in his second video, he discusses one of the members that I don't have currently in the Silver Age, which is H.P. Lovecraft. At least not the Lovecraft that you're probably expecting, like Call of Cthulhu and that sort of shit. To me, they are still a part of what made fantasy interesting at this time, but they were the least fantasy-themed of any of the books that I have. And so when it came to making the cuts for these lists, they were one of the unfortunate ones that had to go. To show respect, I did leave in Lovecraft's The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadeth, as it seemed a little bit more fantasy-centric to me. Confirm or deny in the comments. But in terms of strictly fantasy, the 1920s were a surprisingly respectable decade. On top of Edison and Dunsany in the epic fantasy lane, we have Lud in the Mist acting as one of fantasy's earliest weird tales, and pulp heavy hitters like Ship of Ishtar, and of course Howard's Conan and Kane series, ending the decade with a new king of fantasy. Because if there is one series the early Silver Age is known for, it's probably Robert E. Howard's Conan. For the first time, the fantasy genre had a unified hero, a celebrity character that perfected the pulp magazine meta. With what follows after, it's difficult for many to realize just how impactful Howard and his 30s companion Fritz Leiber would be for the future of fantasy. Think anything D&D or Moorcock or The Witcher, all the way up to Joe Abercrombie. This is where that lane of fantasy truly began. For my modern day reading expectations, as well as the difficulty in finding any publishing data, I decided to put all of the Conan books into the 3 omnibus editions that were released, a little bit later, but I think it's fine. Same for the Once and Future King series, which came out in the 30s and 40s, but was released as one book in 1958. And this is mostly just to do for the authenticity's sake of reading it when it actually came out, but also not being bogged down in trying to be too much of a purist and just reading it in the way that's probably the most enjoyable. The 1930s still continued the 2 lanes of fantasy it was best known for, the pulp stories and the occasional weird fantasy that I've added to give myself some more varied reading during this time. But of course, the true biggest moment of the 30s, and possibly the entire Silver Age up to this point, happens, of course, in the year 1937. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien is released, and it is truly something. It's difficult to say what one thing made The Hobbit truly a big success at the time, but I'd say the 2 main reasons are, 1, it's just general quality, being one of the best children's books to ever be released in the fantasy genre, and 2, how it used its fantasy elements. Because The Hobbit, even before The Lord of the Rings came out, was probably the best ever usage of secondary world fantasy. I could be wrong, but since it's Middle-earth, I'm probably just going to put my money down on it. But while The Hobbit was massive, it was really only one children's book, and I doubt many foresaw what it would become. The Hobbit marks the beginning of the final stage of the Silver Age.
The consolidation.
C.S. Lewis shows up with his space trilogy, and of course Narnia, cementing himself as the heir to George MacDonald's allegorical fantasy lane. But more books still come out in the latter stage of the 40s and the early 50s, like Well of the Unicorn, The Dying Earth, Gormenghast, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, and it's this last author, Paul Anderson, who really gets hard done by. Because right before Lord of the Rings hits the shelves and becomes big, this guy kind of was the next evolution of epic fantasy. Not that he is Tolkien before Tolkien, but he kind of was the heir to what fantasy could have been. But the real story of the Silver Age doesn't happen until 1954 for obvious reasons. The different lanes of fantasy, action-adventure, sword and sorcery, Lewis's whimsical Narnia, Edison's epic fantasy, and Dunsany's lyrical prose have been hanging like loose threads in the air. But in hindsight, for all this time, the Silver Age was simply barreling towards something bigger. And when Fellowship of the Ring hits the shelves, fantasy is changed forever. And so looking at it as a whole, the Silver Age is one of the most interesting times for the fantasy genre. In hindsight, everything lies under Tolkien's shadow, but they didn't know that at the time. It feels like a time we may never go back to, or so you think. We'll get to that later.
Textbook foreshadowing.
Now, I imagine this is the part of the video where half of my audience, the ones who are more interested in the older style of fantasy, will say something like, this is where the genre changed and became classless and derivative. And the other half say something akin to, oh, this is where fantasy finally gets fun. And that's because the shift in fantasy after The Lord of the Rings is the biggest we have probably ever seen. And we enter the third era of fantasy called classic fantasy, which spans from the years 1960 to 1989. And with a name like classic fantasy, you might be one of the people thinking that this is where fantasy gets a little bit boring. I mean, at least compared to the craziness that was the Silver Age. But, and this may shock you, I think the classic fantasy age is actually my favorite of any of them, at least when it comes to talking about it, because my level of interest has far less to do with the actual books that came out during this time, and instead it has everything to do with what was happening in the genre. Again, I like to present these eras with their own little mini story arcs. And classic fantasy is what I like to call the Great Reaction. This is a 30-year stretch of fantasy that's basically just them trying to figure out what the hell just happened with Lord of the Rings. And there are a few big reactions to note. One, after The Lord of the Rings gains the bulk of its popularity in the 60s, publishers attempt to strike gold again. This leads to what classic fantasy is probably best known for, the swaths of Tolkien derivatives. But the second reaction is that you also have plenty of authors that are just continuing what happened in the Silver Age. Plenty more serialized, commercial fiction were still printed in magazines or in softcover paperbacks. And the third and most interesting reaction at this time is the counter movement that went up as a rejection of Lord of the Rings. Classic fantasy is where dark fantasy really starts to ramp up, pessimistic to counter Tolkien's optimistic tone. In the 60s, just as Tolkien is really becoming the worldwide sensation, there was a brief time where his influence wasn't so overstated. We get some classics here like Prydain and Dune, which is the big sci fantasy for a while until Pern comes around. We also get the rise of Le Guin's fantasy career with Earthsea. But in the midst of the 60s, another titan emerges, one that really becomes a leading figure of this era, Elric of Melniboné. And just before I get into Elric a little bit more, I need to discuss an observation I've been having about the fantasy genre for a while. And that is that in each age, you kind of have a big three. In rap music, the big three means the biggest three competitors, the most dominant figures in the space at that time. Well, in fantasy, the big three mean something a little bit different. You have optimistic fantasy for readers who want classic, happy ending kind of stories. You have the counter to that, the pessimistic fantasies, for fans who want a grittier, more realistic side of things. And the third pillar, what I call the outlier, is the most interesting. They bring in innovation, nuance, and balance, and are often the most famous or popular of the time. Now, the question then becomes, who represents the big three? Before we can do the classic age, we have to talk about the Silver Age. The optimistic classic fantasy here is obviously Narnia, while the pessimistic is certainly the grittier Conan. And I'd say for a while, the outliers were kind of a split between Dunsany, Edison, and maybe Peake. But when Lord of the Rings comes around at the end of the Silver Age, what slot do you think it inherits? Well, surprisingly at first, I think it actually becomes the outlier. I mean, the fantasy genre had never really seen anything like it before. But by the classic fantasy era, Lord of the Rings becomes so dominant and so genre-defining that it actually usurps Narnia's place as the optimistic branch. If Lord of the Rings is the optimistic, Moorcock certainly becomes the new face of the pessimistic. Dark fantasy lane, if you'd prefer that term, because Lord of the Rings isn't always optimistic, Moorcock certainly isn't always pessimistic. But at least for now, Moorcock certainly leads the rebellion against Tolkienian ideas. But now the real big question is, who is our outlier? I have a number of big series in the 70s. Tolkienian ripoffs really begin to show here, starting with Shannara, but the first inklings of grimdark begin to rise as well, with Thomas Covenant, Elric still going late into this era of course, and the Black Company beginning in the latter stages. Big, epic, weird fantasy also becomes a new strain here, with Book of the New Sun, Dark Tower, and even something like Discworld. I mean, it's certainly not like those other series, but it was definitely weird and original at the time. Now, the classic fantasy era doesn't have as momentous a finale as The Lord of the Rings, but it does have something fairly close. Because for all this time, series like Shannara have led a Tolkien clone party. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, I suppose, none of these series ever really get to Tolkien's level. Much of my reading list for this time is actually filled up with all the counter series and more interesting diversions from Tolkien. Because honestly, as long as you have one or two of the clones, kind of get the gist of it. But the biggest problem with Tolkien clones wasn't that they just took influence from Tolkien, like obviously. It was that they never really tried to do anything new with it. Not reject him like we've seen others do, but take what he had done and try to change it and even improve upon it in certain ways. Which is why Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow and Thorn series was so significant. For pretty much the first time, there was a newcomer on the block who clearly was like Tolkien, but wasn't just Tolkien. And so personally, I think ending with the rise of Memory, Sorrow and Thorn is a decent way to cap off the third age of fantasy. However, I would be lying to you if I said that was the only reason why this era ends here. Because the truth is, there is another series on the horizon. The bridge between classic fantasy and golden age fantasy, which is what I call the fourth era. Let's talk about it. Golden age fantasy is called golden age for one reason. This is where fantasy peaked. I mean, just look at the year 1993. You have peak Witcher, peak Wheel of Time, peak Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, peak Discworld, even peak fucking Star Wars. 2000. What a year for fantasy that was. Peak Guy Gavroche, peak even Harry Potter, peak Robin Hobb, peak Malazan, fucking Storm of Swords. Storm of Swords release date August 8th, 2000. Deadhouse Gates release date September 1. Imagine getting fucking Storm of Swords in August and Deadhouse Gates the next fucking month. Well, of course, I will know because I will be reading all of these series in all of these years in chronological order. And this is exactly what the Golden Age is all about. Big franchise series, big page count, big worlds, more protein, another scoop of protein. All of this Golden Age shenanigans is made possible by one series, The Wheel of Time. More than just being the transition between classic and modern fantasy in the simple terms, Wheel of Time is just as influential on what it did to fantasy epics. Can you honestly imagine a Silver Age fantasy that is 15 books long and full of 1,000-page novels? It just couldn't exist. But The Wheel of Time made it viable. In the opening year of 1990 alone, we get 2 Wheel of Time volumes, the conclusion of Earthsea, the midway of Hyperion, the first of GGK's classics, and the return of Drizzt, which is where I will be likely starting him for the challenge. 1993 sees Memory, Sorrow and Thorn conclude with its massive To Green Angel Tower. Additionally, The Witcher's first publication in Polish, Jenny Wirtz's solo project, The Wars of Light and Shadow. There's also Terry Goodkind, more GGK, a little Dark Tower adjacent to Stephen King just to add in some spice, and the Golden Age continues its hot run all the way through the 90s, introducing iconic series like A Song of Ice and Fire and Harry Potter. And these two series are really what brings fantasy at this stage to the masses. Harry Potter, because duh, and A Song of Ice and Fire gaining a ton of attention even before the show arrived. Now, the turn of the millennia is where we first see the Golden Age begin to kind of change. Big series like Malazan begin, perhaps the final dream, the epitome of all that the Golden Age stood for. But alongside it grows this tiny little urban fantasy called the Dresden Files. Now, every time I look at the year 2000 and see Stormfront there, it just kind of breaks my brain a little bit, because Dresden Files is always a little bit older than I imagined it to be. But the first years of the 2000s continue this branching out zone, with American Gods, Aragon being the first real self-publishing success, China Mieville keeping that weird fiction spirit alive, Kushiel's Dart, and Prince of Nothing joining the ranks. But the real end of the Golden Age is probably a little bit surprising to people, because unlike other eras, there doesn't seem to be much of a big change or massive event in the genre to close it out. Like what really happens in 2004. Wheel of Time, Realm of the Elderlings, Song of Ice and Fire, Malazan, and Dresden all go on into the 2010s and beyond. But the one series that doesn't is The Dark Tower by Stephen King. It's one of the series that has been steadily growing in the background all the way from the 70s. And after getting hit by a drunk driver in 1999, Stephen King would decide to finish his magnum opus in quick succession. And so I decided that the end of the Golden Age would mark Stephen King's final run. And so upon viewing the entirety of the Golden Age up to this point, it's fantasy peaking in a commercial way, finally figuring out a format that can simultaneously carry on Tolkien's legacy at a high level, while also still being innovative and genre defining. Nearly every series I have on the list at this time was a hit in some way, and these are still the same series we see pop up on everyone's top 10 list. But as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And while I wouldn't say that Golden Age necessarily fell in the next era, it certainly fractured, because now we enter modern fantasy. The fantasy we all know here on BookTube. And on the surface, it might appear like Golden Age 2.0, but it kind of faces a middle child syndrome at times, because as good as the Golden Age years were, You just can't simply stay in it forever. Modern fantasy, over the course of 15 years, was forced, no matter how great it was, to leave the golden age and make a new mold for itself. I decided to start the modern fantasy age with the person who defines it the most. Brandon Sanderson's first release, 2005's Elantris. Now, Sanderson's early career with Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive, and obviously finishing The Wheel of Time, definitely feel like Golden Age Part 2. I'd say the same with Joe Abercrombie's starting career. The First Law clearly being a natural progression of the Fritz Leiber, Moorcock, Black Company, George Martin grimdark lane. Between the years of 2005 to 2010, we see the rise of a plethora of new talents. Sanderson's Mistborn series redefines hard magic systems, making it one of modern fantasy's defining characteristics. Abercrombie blends grimdark, humor, and low magic in a fresh new way. Pat Rothfuss enters the scene with the smash success Name of the Wind. Harry Potter finally finds a competitor in Percy Jackson before both series reach their beloved endings. Adding the tragic passing of Robert Jordan and Sanderson stepping up to take the Wheel of Time, we literally see the passing of the torch at this time. And once the 2010s roll around, we really begin to see the peak Sanderson era. Not only does he deliver his best work, the height of his main series, the Stormlight Archive, but we also see the shift from a more dense epics to more Sanderson light writing styles. A focus on accessibility becomes more important than ever as reading becomes immersed into social media. Additionally, the growing resentment of authors taking too long to write their books, with Martin, Rothfuss, and Lynch kind of making up the trifecta there begins a shift in the genre towards rewarding authors who can publish more material quicker. Again, this is the Sanderson dominance era, where at the early stage, something like keeping a progress bar for your writing was considered something revolutionary. I'm sorry, y'all, but is that seriously something that is like that impressive? Like, imagine if any other job didn't do that. But finally, by the late 2010s, things finally began to change. Because somewhere in the blissful days of 2016, one little self-pub series is secretly setting the stage, Cradle by Will White. I can't describe to you how weird it is that Cradle comes out in 2016. Like, regardless if you like the series or not, this guy was a fucking pioneer. And from this point on, we enter modern fantasy's great fracturing point. Suddenly the old ways are dying. Booktube is on the rise, self-publishing is becoming increasingly viable, and the old guard just aren't putting out enough books to maintain dominance. We get a lot of interesting, unique fantasy at this point. Kings of the Wild, Greenbone Saga, Rage of Dragons, The Poppy War. There's not as many Wheel of Time or Tolkien clones to be found. And naturally, this makes sense. We can't stay in the golden age forever, and with self-publishing opening up the floodgates to more creative works, we see fantasy fans slowly, even if they don't realize it, move on from the tried and true method. Epic fantasy with medieval settings and 10-book epics, they're certainly not dead in the water, but no longer are they cutting edge. By the time 2019 rolls around, if you look at the playing field, you maybe have 2 or 3 of the biggest releases be more classic style fantasy. So maybe the year-by-year quality isn't going to be as high as the Golden Age was, but it's certainly a more interesting and diverse time to be a fantasy fan. I would personally know. That 2018-2019 time was when I first got into BookTube, and so I got to watch a ton of these series gain traction and push the needle. You didn't really see it at the time, but fantasy was changing. The only question was if fantasy was changing for the better. Now, where I decide to end the modern age is probably a bit of a surprise. If you ask an average BookTuber reader or reviewer today, they'd probably still consider themselves to be reading modern fantasy. Now, these new books count as modern in the sense that they are new, but I feel like more readers should take a look at where the genre is now in 2026 and truly ask themselves, is this where we were in 2018, 2010, 2005? To me, something has definitely changed. And while most will probably comment something like, you can't tell you're in a new age until it's over, I stand pretty confident that in 2019, modern fantasy is coming to an end. The only thing it needs is one final push. Now, when the virus that shall not be named came around, I highly doubt there were many people thinking about the lineage of epic fantasy history at that point. I, of course, was. COVID was an interesting time for me. I was in the 11th grade, preparing to start writing my very first novel. By the time it was March break, we were getting an additional week off. 1 week turned to 2, then 3, then 4, then whole months were being taken off. It was certainly a surreal time, but luckily for me, none of my family were damaged or hurt by it, which is great. And so, aspiring writer that I was, I used those 6 months I got off from school to write my novel and pumped out about 120k words in under 2 months. I was truly moving like 2010 Sanderson. But I certainly wasn't the only one affected by the pandemic. Publishing was taking a bit of a hit. bit. And by a bit, I mean a fucking Mike Tyson blow to the face. And so the year 2020 marks the final year of the modern fantasy era. Because after this, everything changes. Book Talk changes everything, and people are finally creating bestsellers out of self-published fantasy. And only a few of the old guard really managed to weather the storm. And so the best way to end the modern fantasy era, I thought, was with Battleground by Jim Butcher. It only felt right. And so we enter the last era, the one we are currently in the middle of right now. And as you probably would guess, it's a little bit surreal for me to make this video. Because in a sense, if these eras do kind of catch on, there is a chance that whatever name I pick here ends up becoming shorthand for whatever the hell time we're in right now. The internet age, the platinum age, self-pub fantasy, the AI age, God help us. I decided on one name that I think captures the essence. So without further ado, welcome to the industrial age of fantasy. I call it the industrial age for a few reasons. A, the vibe of the modern world really just reminds me of a modern industrial age.
Just try to think about happy thoughts.
But also the word industrial perfectly describes what has happened to fantasy recently. Self-pub, AI on the rise, book talk algorithms, Kickstarters, even down to the genres of books that are now dominating. Lit RPG, progression fantasy, cozy fantasy, romantasy, sci fantasy becoming really popular again. These books are workmanlike, serialized, and the furthest from Tolkienisms and early mythic fantasy that we ever have been. But perhaps it's the most unique and interesting time of fantasy we've ever been in as well. To me, the industrial age almost feels like the Silver Age Part 2. Instead of pulp, we have serialized progression fantasies like Dungeon Crawler Carl and He Who Fights with Monsters. There's also just authors that are trying new shit out. New ways of telling stories, new genres to explore. But I honestly can't speak much further on the industrial age of fantasy because it's not done. It may not be done for another 10, 20 years or whatever. Maybe by the time I reach the end of the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge, I'll be able to see it clear. But for now, we're right in the thick of it. However, I do have one prediction. Like I said, I see the Industrial Age as a second Silver Age, which means fantasy's kind of in a bit of a loop. I think this happens a lot in art and just life in general. Trends come back after a long time with subtle differences. Because what's really the difference between something like Cradle and the Ship of Ishtar? They are consumed and produced in very similar ways. And even their reputations for the time that they were in were kind of similar. Some new folks getting with the program and seeing the potential, and older folks not really getting it. And hell, maybe I am one of those old heads. We shall have to see. But the thing is, we all know how the Silver Age ended. And so maybe something like that can happen again. Maybe 2030 or 2040, after fantasy has spread its wings in every possible direction, some great new novel, a new Tolkien, will come around and change everything again. And we'll be headed into a new era that we could have never predicted. But would that be for the best? Some fantasy fans say that after Tolkien, fantasy became stale and cliché. And on the other side, some say that Tolkien laid down the blueprint from which so many other great series perfected. I can't say as much as the next person. Not now, maybe not even after the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge is done. But that certainly won't stop me from trying. And so, if you would like to join me on that journey, you can. This channel is all about the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge, where I attempt to read every single major fantasy in chronological order. I have an entire playlist where you can watch each and every review that I post. You could even watch them in order if you want to see the evolution like I do. We have so many books to go through and so many eras to discover. I hope this video on the 6 eras of fantasy was fun. I'm certain there's going to be so many comments about how wrong I was, or how I can't really make any of these claims without having read every single book in this timeline. And like fair, maybe once I read all these books, I can go back and revise these eras to be more accurate to what I think the genre has become. Because every single book I showed you today is on the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge TBR. And we will be able to discuss and review and see the evolution of the fantasy genre together. So in the future, if you see another comment on another video that's like, what is the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge? Or what are these 6 eras he keeps talking about? Please send them directly to this video. I want every single one of my subscribers and people who watch this channel to know the terms Great Fantasy Reading Challenge and the 6 eras of fantasy. Another way to really help would be subscribing and liking and commenting whatever you think. I have a Goodreads account linked in the description that you can follow if you want to keep up with the Great Fantasy Reading Challenge. And again, if you want to see the entire list, it'll be in the pinned comment of the video or in the video description. But for now, I will see you soon. Ciao.